Welcome to Environment Long Island. I am Karl Grossman with Kevin McAllister. He's the founder and president of an organization called Defend H2O. And if I could read the mission of Defend H2O: defending clean water and the coastal zone. It's a non-for-profit organization formed in 2014 to protect and restore the environmental quality of groundwater on which we're all dependent on. It's a sole source aquifer we live above. All that potable water is under our feet. Surface waters, wetlands, and beaches on and around Long Island. The organization's goals are achieved through scientific analysis, and my guest, Kevin McAllister, is a marine scientist, public education, and participation in the regulatory and legislative review of projects, programs, and other actions that affect water quality and habitat values. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Karl. That was a mouthful.
Well, it's quite the mission, you know, and it's
Yeah, no, I wanted it to be very accurate, technically accurate as to what the objectives are of the organization.
Now, we're recording this program today as the East End, all of Long Island, is being pelted by the remnants, so to speak, but they're not weak remnants of Hurricane Ian. I mean, it's really raining outside and the wind is blowing. Here's a headline, this is just yesterday, from the Associated Press. Ian shows, this is the headline, the risks and costs of living on barrier islands. Hurricane Ian underscores the vulnerability of the nation's barrier islands and the increasing costs of people living on the thin strips of land that parallel the coast. As hurricanes become more destructive, experts question whether such exposed communities can keep rebuilding in the face of climate change. And you have, you've been calling for years for retreat, to have homes, they're often some are cottages, some are, I suppose, homes, built in the teeth of the ocean, not rebuilt after a big storm, but have the folks move, perhaps with their homes, away from the threat of the Atlantic Ocean.
Correct.
What do you think should Hurricane Ian and the enormous damage it's done in Florida? I mean, Sanibel Island is been decimated. What lesson do you think it should teach to we here in Long Island?
Well, I really hope it's a strong wake-up call. Obviously the intensity of that storm, the duration, with storm surge, it did enormous damage to the barrier islands. And, now we're at a pause where we're considering rebuilding and investing back into those areas. And I would urge, for a pause and to rethink, again, occupying areas that are low-lying. Again, the likelihood of other storms as well as sea level rise, the long-term prospect of retaining on those areas is untenable.
Let's jump right to a very important analysis and a plan done by the town of East Hampton over a 2-year period. It's titled Coastal Assessment Resilience Plan, acronym CARP. And based on the projected range of sea level rise, now I'm quoting from the actual report, this will transform East Hampton into a series of islands with permanent submergence of low-lying areas as early as 2070. And that's not that far away. I mean, it's like less than 50 years away.
Yes. The projections in New York State, I believe mid was 11 to 30 inches over the next 30 plus years. That's enormous. It will perch groundwater, so coastal inundation will become more prevalent where, higher tides are flooding neighborhoods. the CARP study or plan did a very good job of technical analysis. In other words, using the data that's available on elevations, sea level rise projections to really define vulnerable areas. And now we're at a juncture where through planning and legislation, we have to define what the future of these vulnerable areas are. And certainly for downtown Montauk, the front row, as I call it, the row of hotels and condominiums, roughly 10 buildings in the downtown, I believe we really have to relocate and extinguish those structures over the long term.
Yeah, well, CARP proposes a retreat. They call it, but some people prefer relocate. It's
Yes.
less, retreat sounds like we're losing, but relocate sounds like we're just kind of switching strategy of waterfront development away from the shoreline. Now, Montauk is really a case in point. It was about a decade ago. The Army Corps of Engineers decided to put these geotextile, big sandbags, huge sandbags, along the coast of Montauk. And the Army paid for the original installation, but the town of East Hampton has been paying taxpayers here for the maintenance of that long line of gigantic sandbags. Perhaps elaborate on the project and its significance.
You're correct. It's, I think, 8 years now since installation. The sandbag seawall encompasses roughly a quarter mile of shoreline. This vulnerable area that I'm describing with the older hotel structures. It comprises, I think, 14,000 sandbags in a revetment structure. Ultimately, the installation required as part of the permit that the town maintain, I call it a veneer of sand, so the cover of sand over the bags for aesthetic purposes, initially with plantings. And before the Army Corps passed it to the town for management, the project itself, there was already, I believe, close to $1 million that had to restore before handoff, and subsequently every year post winter storm events, the town has roughly spent $750,000 to $1 million a year to replenish sand over the tops of the bags and to put some fronting beach, in front of the seawall itself.
And describe how that beach in Montauk looks like with those giant sandbags.
Some of the commentary, it got the slang title "Dirtbag Beach." The material that was placed into the bags came from a sand mine, not compatible ocean beach sediments, and ultimately it was had an orange coloration to it. Certainly does not respond as a natural beach, and by virtue of that seawall, over time, absent sand replenishment, that beach will narrow, it will try to retreat, it will be impinged by the wall itself, and we'll end up with basically no longer having a recreational beach in front of downtown Montauk.
Wow.
Absent sand.
There's been such resistance to stopping the sandbag project. You went to court over that. And,
Yes, we tried to sue the town as well as the Army Corps. We filed an injunction to stop the work. We did not prevail, and we felt that the outcome would not be favorable, so we withdraw the lawsuit, and the rest is history. But I will say, at the time, I urged the community to pay attention that this would not be the first nor the last installation of shoreline hardening that East Hampton is grappling with.
What should be done? What do you think? There's been such resistance, not just to the judicial resistance to the placement of the sandbags, but the town has been urging a few years back relocation, but enormous resistance in Montauk.
Karl, managing receding shorelines in the face of climate change and sea level rise, there's really three options. We either embark on sand replenishment into the foreseeable future, roughly a lifespan of 4 years, $15–20 million, a sand pump, no end in sight. We construct massive seawalls, geotextile sandbags, rocks, steel walls to defend, or we move back. And certainly the seawalls will destroy our recreational beaches, so that should be a non-consideration. And I think we have to really wake up as to what the true costs of sand replenishment will be over the long term, and start really moving back from these vulnerable areas that have already been identified. We know where they exist. Girard Drive in East Hampton, fronting Accabonac Harbor. There's homes that are, sitting on stilts, completely immersed. The water surrounds the property. We have to extinguish these uses and withdraw from these areas, because the prospect of, again, millions and millions of dollars over the long term, where we're not cognizant of the logistics involved. Bringing in dredges, large ships to pump sand that is 10 miles away from the destination, when every community up and down the eastern seaboard is asking for the same help from the federal government and trying to line up the same dredges from the same companies. It's untenable over the long term, and the sooner we recognize this, the sooner we'll move. And with respect to carp, the carp says the right things about retreat, but I believe the legislative body, the town board, really has to be poised and to move on condemnation or eminent domain after a reasonable period of time, 15 years. If we're not moving back by then, we've got to make it happen.
How do you feel when you, there's been words that have been created like beach nourishment. So when sand dumping is to happen, you see folks in support of that speaking of it being beach nourishment. Is dumping of sand on a beach nourishment, Kevin?
That's the term of art, I guess, in the industry. Sand replenishment, beach nourishment. Ultimately it is dredging sand from an offshore source. And I can tell you from experience that, the sources offshore don't always match up to to the beach. And case in point, with Montauk being a lot of cobble in the near shore, the Army Corps for sand source has to go roughly 10 miles to the west to utilizing what's called a hopper dredge. They load, they transport, and they pump onto the beach, and have to repeatedly do this. It's a very costly, time-consuming prospect. And again, when every community is in the same need, something's got to give. So I believe we've got to start moving back and compelling property owners to do so, and try to provide, that just compensation to do so as well.
Now, Montauk, what do they call it, the end, isn't alone, this community at the end of the South Fork of Long Island. In fact, you've been very focused in recent time on the armoring of again, not just to try to armor Montauk against the Atlantic Ocean, but to armor the Peconic Bays. Can you describe this? It's kind of a hurricane of armoring which has been going on relatively recently.
I would say, Carl, I started paying attention to it some 25 years ago, because I knew the trend, and from my experience from Florida, having seen that in full action, playing out, I could bring real time locally. And in the last 10 years, because of sea level rise, which is accelerating, the push to armor, so the armoring includes steel bulkheads, stone revetments, geotextile sandbags, as they used in Montauk. But these installations are happening at an alarming rate in the bays. transforming natural shorelines that are critical for shorebirds, horseshoe crab nesting, to ultimately vanish because they are being pinched, submerged with rising seas, or just through storm energy being eroded out. And I would argue that the state agency has been very permissive in allowing these structures to come in, as have local town boards. And
Really, huh?
yes.
Well, that's the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Correct, yes. New York State, and they are charged with, protecting natural resources. And, where I think they've diverged in their administration of policy, what's called protective natural features, the dunes, bluffs, beaches, they're allowing property owners to armor in front of these features, which is in fact transforming them. We're not protecting them. We got to protect the integrity of that transitional zone of again, the shorelines to open water.
And the fact is, armoring accelerates erosion. It doesn't explain how that works.
In the past, and the argument is, we're installing the seawall behind high tide, so therefore it's a non-factor. That's not true. Again, you have sea level rise incrementally coming up, but under storm events where you have surge in energy, blasting against these structures, the reflective energy causes the fronting beach to erode. And it gets to a point where it's unable to recover naturally because of the processes have been so disrupted by the structure itself. And then what happens, another secondary impact is what they call end scour at the end of these structures, where it gets eroded out, forcing the neighboring property to follow suit with another seawall in the forms I've described. And on down the line, and the trend I'm seeing over the last 10, 15 years, there's hardly a reach of shoreline in the Peconic bays that has not been altered with again, these structures. And we're supposed to be doing just the opposite.
Let's talk about how you got involved. I mean, you're a Long Island guy. You're a native of Center Moriches.
Yes.
You spent a good deal of time, too, in Florida to see what Long Island can end up looking like. Just speak of your history and your background, your education in marine science.
Good. Well, it goes back, Karl, and as you pointed out, I'm a Moriches kid. I grew up on the bay, a beautiful undeveloped barrier island, ocean beaches. So, I was able to connect with the natural environment, and I followed my pursuit in education. So my training is in biological sciences, marine, as well as coastal zone management. I moved to Florida to finish college, worked roughly 16 years down there, predominantly in shoreline protection and the regulatory side of things. I believe my experience really framed and shaped what I wanted to do with my career. I felt that I would be more impacted perhaps as an advocate on the outside, recognizing the constraints of government and also the push from the private sector to try to bring environmental protection to the fore, and to really to be able to identify the issues in a strong way. And having returned to the island 20 some odd years ago, I've been doing advocacy work since.
You were the Peconic Baykeeper for a bunch of years?
16 years, correct, and then I formed Defend H2O.
Now, President Biden recently signed legislation to encourage nature-based climate solutions, including when it comes to, well, I don't know if it's an oxymoron, shoreline protection. I mean, it's such a very important book was written a number of years ago. Orrin Pilkey, who similar background to yours, highly educated in coastal issues. The beaches are moving was the So that,
Perfect Monica.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the president has signed this legislation promoting nature-based climate solutions in terms of, among other things, shoreline protection, so-called shoreline protection. What would be the way we should interrelate or just relate with the shoreline?
To the extent of managing sand, one of the areas that I thought was deficient relative to my experience in South Florida was sand bypassing at the inlets. Navigable inlets have a great deal of effect on the available sand. In other words, the incoming tide will carry it into the bay, deposit it, and same offshore. So we have to be very deliberate in going after those sand deposits with dredging and continually move the sand over. Again, for nature-based approach, it is living more softly on the coast. And in particular on the bay side, it's protecting the integrity of wetlands. Wetlands are giant sponges that have the ability to absorb floodwater. They cleanse water, through uptake, just their physical being. They're just an important component to estuarine ecology and our own resiliency. And what I described, this trend in armoring that includes the loss of wetlands or building seawalls behind wetlands where they can't migrate, that's the antithesis of resiliency. So, we've got to really do things differently and be all in on nature-based solutions and not I'll say distort them by using these terms, but in fact doing something entirely different that is in contrary to those goals.
And you were, I think, a major figure in pushing the Army Corps to include sand bypass mechanisms in this Fire Island to Montauk project. I wrote about the importance of sand bypass that would be put in front of inlets. And instead of sand being sucked into inlets and ending up creating huge shoals in bays and so forth, the sand would be continued, the movement of the sand would continue along the shoreline.
Yes.
The Army wasn't listening at all decades ago, but apparently maybe your call for sand bypass as part of the Fire Island to Montauk project has...
I think so. I've been calling it, calling attention to it for some time and directly with the Army Corps. I think in the past, they have a template as to how they do things, including recovering sand that might be lost from, navigable inlets. And I'm urging that you do things differently. You be more proactive in recovering that sand with greater frequency, to keep the volume at the maximum extent possible at vulnerable downdrift areas, such as the commercial docks in Shinnecock that were almost lost 2 winters ago, and there had to be real triage to save that area.
But otherwise, the Army Fire Island to Montauk plan is what you call it, just a sand dumping plan, and it's going to cost over $3 billion to dump sand.
And here's where buyers beware. For public consumption, it's assumed that this is a federal project entirely, financially, and that the billions that are being spent will come exclusively from the federal government. The first time through with pumping sand on these various segments of beach, from Robert Moses to Montauk, downtown Montauk, that will be on the federal expenditure, but subsequent beach nourishment projects roughly every 4 years will have to be a cost share with the state of New York, Suffolk County, the town, the villages. The tax base of this area will have to contribute to perpetual sand replenishment, and I would argue that it disincentivizes property owners from seeing reality that we've got to move back.
I remember a former Suffolk County executive, John V.N. Klein. Mm-hmm. He opposed, because the original notion with that Army plan was not just to dump sand, but to build these rock jetties into the ocean, they call them. the Army calls them groins. He just, and when the push was on to build many groins along the barrier beach in the West Hampton area, which turned out to be disastrous because rob Peter to pay Paul. The
Yes,
groins would
yes.
catch sand, moving the little drift, but depriving
Yeah.
the beach
Precisely.
down the coast from having sand. He spoke of this building of so-called groins, hand wrestling with God, that it was folly. Your feelings about John Klein's?
Well, I watched those groins as a child in awe as these trucks would come in with giant boulders from New England, one after the other. I think there was it 11? I forget the
15 total.
15 total, excuse me. And I guess they came up short on the plan to go right to Morich's Inlet with the groin field. For every action there is a reaction. There was a scour effect from the downdrift side of the groins. Pike's Inlet punched through in one of the big storms, and then subsequently a new village was created as a result of litigation. Arguing that the Army Corps, messed up in their project and therefore responsible for sand replenishment for the next 50 years. And I believe we're roughly 30 years into sand replenishment for this area.
Sounds to me that retreat or relocation and living in harmony with nature along the shore, in fact, living in harmony with nature, period, it's critical for, dealing with our shoreline and not hand wrestling with God. Thank you, Kevin McAllister,
Thank
for
you, Carl. I always appreciate you, having me. Thank you.
Well, for your important work. I mean, often you're a lone voice at some of these public hearings, but to speak sense, to tell truth to some of, certainly the Army Corps of Engineers often doesn't listen. In fact, most of the time doesn't, and to some.
Well, I think you cited an example of perhaps they will, so it's all good,
Well, thanks again, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Environment Long Island. I'm Karl Grossman.